In recent years, the term privilege has become a kind of buzzword that's used in conjunction with critical race theory or identity politics or racist anti-racism movements. It's often used with reference to groups that are in the majority of a society / groups believed to be at the top of a power hierarchy within society. Now, the term itself essentially refers to any supposed benefits that one group has over and above another group. So, for instance, where one group is said to have, say, greater opportunity for upward economic mobility, the greater that margin of opportunity is their privilege. Oftentimes, proponents of critical race theory rage against the existence of privilege. But how does the Bible view it? First, the Bible makes it clear that in God's providence, there will not exist an equality of privilege in this world. God ordains the exact times and boundaries in which people live. Acts chapter 17, verse 26. And as a result of His sovereign superintending of history, people will have differing levels of privilege. Those, for instance, who lived during the Dark Ages would look at those of us who live in the 21st century, and they would acknowledge that on many, many levels, we have much greater privileges than they did. Those living during the Old Covenant context, if they were to affirm the truth rightly, they would say that Israel had greater privilege than any other nation in the world. As the Apostle Paul noted in Romans chapter 3, what advantage has the Jew? And then he would go on and say, much in every way. In fact, Yahweh declared in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, that He chose Israel out of and above all the nations of the earth. Furthermore, Old Testament saints did not have the privilege of revelation that New Testament saints enjoy. And the examples could go on and on. There will be children who will be born with two parents. There will be children that will be born with one parent. There will be children that will be born with different physical attributes than another child. Some will have greater strengths. Some will have limitations. Some will be born in different geographic locations that will undergo different circumstances. For example, say wildfires or earthquakes, etc. And all of those variables and a seemingly innumerable host of others ensure the impossibility of an equality of privilege. Now it goes to show that from God's vantage point, not only is the existence of differing measures of privilege not sinful, but there must be so much more to life than privilege. Now, second, you cannot assume that the existence of privilege necessarily assumes that a privileged person is privileged, and as a result of that privilege is oppressing a less privileged person. So you cannot assume that a privileged person is oppressing a less privileged person. If the mere existence of differences in privilege necessitated the sin of either oppression, right, just the existence of different measures of privilege, if that necessitated oppression, or if it necessitated the sin of indifference, either way, the alleviation of differences of privileges would be a biblical mandate. But there is no such biblical mandate. There's no warrant for governing magistrates to enforce an equality of privilege. There is no mandate for local church pastors to manufacture an equality of privilege. And we'll see more of this when we get into our study of communism, but think about the instruction that the Apostle Paul gave through Timothy to New Testament Christians who were rich. You can see that in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 and 18. The rich were commanded to do good and be rich in good works and to share, but that wasn't a manufactured imposition of them denouncing their privilege and coming to a place of economic equality with those in the local church where they were. They were to do that out of Christ-honoring act of love, a Christ-honoring act of love. And it was not manufactured and it was not imposed. Think about the New Testament church. In the New Testament church, you had rich and poor Christians alike. You had Christian slaves and Christian masters, worshiping alongside of one another. They shared the greatest of all privileges, namely equality of sonship in Jesus Christ. And they were not mandated to equalize all the lower privileges. They shared the greatest, and they were not mandated to equalize all of the lower temporal ones. Now, third, it should not be assumed that a person has their privilege as a result of other people being oppressed in previous generations, and thus must make restitutions for wrongs committed by others who have long since passed away against people who have long since passed away. It would be impossible to quantify what opportunities were lost or how the trajectory of people's lives were changed as a result of wrongs committed against previous generations. Think of this, for example. How do you quantify the murder of a person's, or the effects of a murder of a person's great-grandfather during the infancy of that person's grandfather, and the effect that that would have on subsequent generations? How do you quantify that? How do you begin to do an analysis of what would have been if that person's great-grandfather didn't die during the infancy of that person's grandfather? You can go on and you could ask, does the murderer's great-grandson owe something to the victim's great-grandson? Not according to the rule of Scripture. Deuteronomy 24:16, Ezekiel 18:20. There you see the principle that a father shall not be punished for the sins of a son, and the son shall not be punished for the sins of a father. To use language from Ezekiel 18:20, a man's righteousness shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon themselves. Furthermore, how do you account for the differences in things like work ethic, or natural ability, and providential opportunity when comparing two allegedly oppressed individuals from the same community that had significantly different outcomes? Now, I say that to say privilege can result from a number of things unrelated to oppression. And rather than cultivating privilege envy, which is sin, every human being is called to humble themselves before the God who determines when, where, and how long people live. And regardless of the privilege that one does or doesn't have, to borrow some language from Acts 17:27, they are not far away from repenting of their sin and receiving the greatest of all privileges, forgiveness through faith in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And then as sons and daughters of the living God, in light of Luke chapter 12, verse 48, doubtless we would be those who have received much. And to those who have been given much, much is required. And we are called, in light of Galatians chapter 6, verse 10, to do good to all men, especially the household of faith. And we are to do good, not as a penance for privilege, but we are to do good out of gospel-rooted love for men and women, and most ultimately for God. That's why you are to do good, not as some sort of penance for privilege, but out of gospel-rooted love.